Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Tuesday, February 8th meeting of the House Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee. I apologize that we are starting a little late this morning. Calendar meeting ran long. Today we're going to have a series of presentations about advanced energy sources or renewable energy sources. You'll recall that going all the way back to day one of our committee, when we had the presentation from the KCC, we talked about the value of having a diverse portfolio of energy sources, that not all sources work as well in different environments. Like we saw with Winter Storm Uri, where we relied more on dispatchable power. There are other times of the year where we can rely more on renewable sources of energy. So this is a presentation today to kind of give that side of the market and what's going on in that space. And so to that end, we're going to start with Mr. Mark Walter, Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs for Savion. And Mr. Walter, we welcome you to the committee.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you very much for letting me be here. My name is Mark Walter. I am the Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs for a company called Savion, which is based in Kansas City. I do all the legislative regulatory affairs for our entire country, which this is one of the few times in my career when I have gotten to actually drive to the place where I am working on policy. And for that, I am very grateful to all of you. I live in Kansas City. That is where Savion is headquartered. I will talk today about the company itself and what we're structured like and what we do. I'm going to talk about utility scale solar, utility scale storage, which is basically grid scale batteries, and then a lot about the development process. And my hope today is that not only can I try to answer any questions you might have about utility scale development, but also that you can build at least some kind of relationship here so that if you have questions in the future, you're welcome to reach out to me at any time. I'm an hour down the road and I'm happy to help out however, and I understand that this legislative session, there's an awful lot of energy stuff going on with utility scale renewables. So without further ado, I'm gonna move to slide number 3, the About Us slide. So as I said, Savion is a Kansas City-based company. We were founded in 2019. We're actually a spinoff of a company called Tradewind Energy, which was based in Lenexa, Kansas. I worked for Tradewind for about 2 years. Tradewind was purchased by Enel Green Power, which is a massive global company based in Italy that has major headquarters in DC and New York. And we were purchased by Macquarie, the solar and storage portfolio, Macquarie Capital. We have since been sold to Shell. So I am a big oil employee, believe it or not. So we were purchased in December. I now work for Shell. Savion is a wholly owned subsidiary of Shell New Energies. We have projects across 28 states. That number changes all the time. We've been growing pretty significantly, especially into the West. Most of our projects are in the Midwest and kind of Pacific, Ohio, Pennsylvania-ish region. We have 125 employees right now. We don't own and operate. We only do the development. So 125 is indicative of a pretty large company. 45 of those employees are based in Kansas. Most of those are going to be some 30-ish miles from the Kansas City region, which is our headquarters, of course. We have over 2,013 megawatts of projects that are operational right now. And like I said, we don't operate them. We do the development, we do the permitting, the interconnection with the utilities, all of the engineering work. And then when a project has got a nice tidy bow on it and it's ready to get built, we'll sell it to somebody like Evergy, for example, who's going to buy it. They don't want to do all the crazy work of the 3, 5, 6 years of development. They just want to have a project that's ready to get built. And at that point, we'll sell it to them. They'll do the construction 9 times out of 10, and then they'll own it and operate it for the next 30 to 40 years. So that's an example. We sell to lots and lots of different kinds of companies. Some of them are independent power producers. Some of them are utility scale utilities themselves. Right now we have, in terms of solar in development, I'm publicly talking about just under 10,000 megawatts. I'm I'm sure that our portfolio is larger than that, but we are in a competitive industry, and about 3,000 megawatts of storage as well. And when I say storage, I'm talking about grid scale batteries. It's the exact same technology as what's in your phone, and it was a U.S. engineered developed product that we now have because of the economies of scale. We've got enormous, basically trailer trucks full of these modular batteries that are typically 4 hours in duration, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go on. In terms of Savion's Kansas portfolio, we have over 600 megawatts of solar, and we've got a single storage project that we're working on as well. These are all going to be connected to the Southwest Power Pool grid. And I apologize if I'm kind of pumping out a fire hose of information here with terms like Southwest Power Pool, SPP, that kind of stuff. If there's ever any question, feel free to stop me, because sometimes I talk to people who know everything, and depending on the state, people really understand the energy infrastructure of their world. Some people don't really, but one way or the other, let me know and I'll be happy to stop and talk through some of these issues. What that 600 megawatts means is over $600 million in capital that we're going to outlay, hopefully in the next 3 to 5 years. That is going to be several hundred employees as well. One of the projects I really like to talk about is our project in Johnson County. It is a brownfield development. So it is, and this is on the news, so I feel comfortable talking about it. It is built on, or it's anticipated to be built on, the Sunflower Army ammunition plant in DeSoto, Kansas. And this is for those of you who know, this is a site that has been sitting fallow for decades. Nothing has really been able to get built on this site since it was decommissioned by the Army. It has been sold into a development company. That development company has been looking for somebody to do something useful with it for a very long time. And we have entered into negotiations with them. We have done the interconnection work. We are in the queue at the Southwest Power Pool right now. There's lots of studying being done, lots of work being done on the local level to try to build relationships and build education and information to get the local consent that's necessary to build these projects. Ultimately, this is going to be a 400 megawatt project, should it get built, that's going to result in over $400 million in capital over the project's lifetime. It will produce enough power for 80,000 homes every day, which will be useful for the region since the cost of solar power is exceedingly low. And during construction, it's going to employ several hundred construction workers for over a year, which is not just good for that particular project, but it's good for all the hotels, the restaurants, and the local economy generally. So the question is, why solar, right? I get this a lot. Solar has really come to the forefront of a lot of state legislatures because companies like mine have been leasing land and building projects at a rate that nobody's seen before. There hasn't been any major policy change that has supported this. This is not driven by incentives. This is driven by unsubsidized cost. And if you'll look at that slide that I put together that says why solar, this is information that was put together by Lazard. Lazard is an economist group that studies energy, and what you're looking at is the levelized cost of building a new facility over that facility's life. So if you take all of the costs necessary to build it and own it and operate it, including fuel over that 30-year lifetime, these are and then subtract all subsidies, period, including the federal tax credit, the federal production tax credit. These are the numbers that you end up with. And you see here that solar crystalline, which is what you see most of the time on houses, and then solar thin film, which is a lesser used technology, are incredibly low, in the $30 per megawatt range, which is, and this is a year old. Those costs have shifted somewhat, but they're generally in the same range, mostly due to supply chain issues that we've experienced. So that's generally why you're seeing solar now so much. It is incredibly cost effective. It is the cheapest energy that you can build now worldwide. As supply chains have gotten better, and global manufacturing has scaled up, and this is global manufacturing. There is very little U.S. solar manufacturing, and I would be happy to talk about ways that we could incentivize more of that, because for not just our issues, but for national security issues, it is important, in my mind, to continue to onshore as much of this production as we possibly can. Right now, a lot of it comes from Southeast Asia. Solar is continuing to drop in cost. So I don't anticipate this trend of solar being so cost effective and being so explosive in growth to dissipate anytime soon. And again, this is not being driven primarily by any kind of subsidy. We're not getting, there's been no new change to the federal tax subsidy or state tax programs in a very long time. So all of this is being driven by drops in the cost of production for us. Another thing that is really helpful is corporate demand. Fortune 500 companies, many of them have stepped up and said, we want to be renewable. We want 100% of our energy to be covered by renewable resources. A lot of this is cost. Again, they want the cheapest energy. They want to make sure that, especially in their manufacturing facilities, that they can control one of the largest costs that is a fluctuating cost. So if they can contract with a company like Savion to build a project and get a guaranteed levelized cost of energy for their facility over 30 years, it just makes good business sense for them. Now, of course, there's window dressing, there's PR that's going to go on top of that. You have companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon that are going to come out and say, we're green and it's good for their customer base. But you also have companies like my company, Shell, saying, we're going to be carbon neutral. There are lots of unsuspecting actors out there that are doing it because it's really, really smart business sense for them. So that's a little bit about why we're here, about why you're experiencing some of the conversations that you're experiencing here in Kansas. I want to make sure that I'm kind of laying out the basics of how we do what we do, how solar and storage work. Solar, thankfully, is incredibly simple, right? You got this magic panel, the sun hits it, magic happens, energy comes out. There's a lot of engineering and science that goes into that. I would be happy to point you to somebody at the University of Kansas that understands it all much better than I do. But for our intents and purposes, sun hits the panel, magic happens, we get electricity. We want to connect that electricity to the grid. And that's not just saying Evergy's grid, but that's the regional grid that we're all connected to. And I'm sure after Winter Storm Uri, you've heard a lot about SPP, the Southwest Power Pool, this big, sprawling electricity market that goes all the way from North Dakota down to northern Texas. So we are right now in that grid, and in order for us to connect to that grid, we have to file for interconnection, which costs an enormous amount of money, multiple millions of dollars. We have to have land leased. We have to do an immense amount of studies, and they put us in this queue, the line to get studied, and that queue takes, right now in SPP, if I were to file today, I would probably get a project built 5 to 7 years from now. So we're talking very long-term investment. These are not projects that could possibly pop up overnight. And we can talk a little bit about, I know there's a conception that we come into communities overnight. That is technically impossible for us to do, right? We couldn't do that if we wanted to. I can talk for sure about why that conception of the industry exists and what we can do to work on that, and I believe Savion is on the forefront of that, but that's certainly not what we do. So to get to the solar storage development stuff, we got solar. Storage is the same. To do the interconnection, we've got to talk to the grid. We've got to make sure that they're doing their studies so that all of the surrounding areas are as unaffected as possible by our interconnection, that the grid can handle us. And if there are any changes that are going to need to be made, we pay for them. The grid does not pay for that. The interconnection customer itself pays for that upgrade. So I added one little extra graph on here to show, you don't hear a lot about storage, or we've heard a lot about it over the years. We haven't seen a lot of it. And this graph here I wanted to put on here just to show why it's starting to come together and why we're starting to hear more about it now. But that pink line on this graph on slide, whatever slide it is, 7-ish, that's showing just how much the cost of batteries, grid scale batteries, has dropped. And that is going to change the industry. When grid scale batteries are ubiquitous, the issues that we have, any reliability issues, and we're talking in the next 5 to 10 years, realistically, reliability issues are going to be mitigated significantly, especially for solar and wind. I don't do any wind, but for companies that produce intermittent energy, 4 hours of power that will help tide over during that night in February when it's 2 degrees out and everybody's got their heat all the way up does an immense amount of help. It helps with the traffic jams that we see on the grid when there's too much constraint from one area to another. All of that results in lower cost. If we can utilize some of the solar that might be pumping out at noon at 2 a.m. instead, because we were able to store it when people didn't need it and put it back on the grid when people did, that helps bring the cost curve down again. So I know you don't get charged by Savion. Your bill comes from a different company, and I have no connection to what they charge whatsoever, but the wholesale market is realistically on a downward curve in terms of price. Storage is really interesting. I would love to spend an hour just talking about storage. It is a very cool technology, like I said, developed on US research. It is largely manufactured here in the United States. That manufacturing is scaling up right now because of electric vehicles primarily. The demand for electric vehicles, it's the exact same technology, and that demand for a growing EV market, which Ford is invested in heavily, GM, all of the US manufacturing companies, they are all using the same technology. So when they scale up, it brings our costs down as well. And we can talk a lot about the crazy things that storage can do on the grid if you're ever interested. But for now, I really wanted to impress upon you the cost and how that cost is coming down and what that might mean for us in the next few years. All of the conversations that I'm having now are about how every project we're going to file is going to have storage associated with it. So it's not just a 100 megawatt solar facility, right? It's a 100 megawatt solar facility with a 4, 6, 8 hour battery attached to it. All right, now the fun thing that I really enjoy talking about and trying to educate as much as I can on is what is development? What does that look like in a community? I am a small town Missourian. I'm from Lake of the Ozarks. My dad's a farmer. I'm the first generation of Walter to not be a farmer. So I've spent enough time in places like this. I grew up in United Methodist Church in Dearborn, Missouri. I don't know if you guys know where that is. Very small town. I know what it feels like when things change. Even the smallest changes can get really rippled out and be felt in a community where there might only be a few thousand people. So I can understand some of the challenges that people are feeling when they hear about a project that they didn't previously know about by a neighbor that they don't have control over their land on, and they're concerned. And people very quickly get kind of spun up into this, I'm gonna get on Facebook kind of tizzy. And it becomes a challenge for everybody because as you understand, not just in energy, but in everything these days, sometimes it gets really hard to decipher truth from misinformation when emotions are high. And these are situations oftentimes when emotions are high. So I want to try my best to explain what it is that we do so that if you have questions or if you have real concerns, that we can address those together. We're going to be in communities for 30 plus years. So if we're not wanted there, if we don't do the good work of building relationships in these communities, then we don't deserve to be there. The onus is on us as a developer to do the work necessary to build the healthy relationships so that these projects can be community partners for the next 20, 30, 40 years. So like I said, before we ever file at the Southwest Power Pool for interconnection, we've got to sign leases. We can't file until we have some form of land control. So the very first step is signing leases with interested landowners. We do not have eminent domain. None of the work that we do is by force. So what we usually do is we'll find a local area that has good interconnection based on our studies. We'll knock on some doors and we'll see if people are interested. A lot of the times it's people in their 50s, 60s who are getting ready to retire or who would like the opportunity to retire, but their kids don't want the farm, or their kids moved to Minnesota and work in Minneapolis and somewhere now, and they're going to end up leasing it out to a tenant farmer, right? And wouldn't it just be easier if we could lease it out to a company that's going to have nothing moving on it for 30 years and just, we're also paying significantly above market rates for corn and beans and the traditional row crops. So there's a financial incentive for people, of course. There is a lot of times there's an angle of, I want to own the land, I want to give it to my kids, but I don't want to have to be concerned with tenant farmers for the next 20 years. So that's kind of where we start. That is where a lot of misconception starts as well, right? Because people are like, well, they're signing leases and we didn't know about it. I get it, but we can't start a project until we know whether there's willing interest on behalf of the landowners. At that point, we're going to enter into the queue. We're going to begin the study process, which, like I said, takes years. In SPP, it's so backed up, it's at least 5 years to go through the full study regime. In that time, we're going to do an awful lot of studies to the land. We're going to figure out what drainage tile looks like. We're going to see what the wildlife looks like. We're going to do all of the studies necessary for engineering. What is the ground made out of? What kind of pilings do we need to put in? All of that work is going to get done in this 3 to 5 year time frame. After we get there's several gating commitments along the way. SPP will come to us and say, hey, we did the first part of your study. We need another $1 million to move forward. Are you good to go? So sometimes, a lot of times actually, projects will die in these multiple different gating items before we ever get close to a project getting built. And so oftentimes you won't hear about us coming to the township or the county because we don't think we have a viable project, or we don't know we have a viable project until SPP tells us that the grid can handle this at X cost. And that cost to us, if it's acceptable, we'll be able to move forward. To give you some understanding, 30% would be an acceptable success rate for us as an industry. If 30% of the projects that we ended up filing at PJ or SPP got built, that would be fantastic. So there isn't necessarily the impetus to come directly to a county or a township on the front end, because there's a 70% chance that we get people really excited about new tax base and jobs, and it doesn't realize. It just doesn't happen. So we try to make sure that on the front end, we're having communications with local affected landowners, non-participants who are nearby, important township, county officials. But these are kind of conversations about, hey, we're here. We want you to know that we're here. We'll eventually bring a permit to you, but we can't be sure that we have a real project yet. So we don't want to get everybody all wound up on both sides of the aisle. Once we get to that point, once SPP comes to us and says, we've done our final study, we know how much it's going to cost, and we need you to fork over the money, then by that point, we've done enough local permitting studies. We've hopefully, if you're a good developer, done enough relationship building on the front end that you're ready to come forward and say, I need a conditional use permit in this county or whatnot. So that's usually the last step, or one of the last steps. If you're a good developer, this is not the first or the 10th or the 100th time that you've talked to the local community about this project, but sometimes there are exceptions to that, which is why we experience challenges. Our industry has come a long way, and Savion, as one of the original developers in Kansas during the trade wind days, I feel like has earned the right to continue to do development in Kansas by helping out a lot of towns that we're in. And I'm really looking forward to continuing to work in this state. I would really love to see this brownfield project get built. There's a great story about some land that has not been able to be used for a long time, and we're hoping to put it to good use. When we get to that point, it'll be about a year and a half of construction. It's a pretty big project, all things considered. So we'll have to see how all that works out. I know there's some permitting zoning questions going on in Johnson County that we're watching very closely that could very well impact our project. I'd be happy to talk about that if anybody is interested. I've already been talking for far too long, so thank you very much for your time. I hope this has been useful. My information is on the last slide, and you are welcome to call me. That's my cell phone number. Reach out at any time. I would be happy to provide as much information as I can. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Walter, we have some committee members that have questions, so
Absolutely.
willing to stand for those. Representative Keither, I think your hand is up.
Yes, it is, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. I find this fascinating because I was certainly involved with proposed project on the Sunflower Army ammunition dump many years ago. And I have been trying to find out what's going on with the land. And you mentioned that you have local need for local permission. So I'm not going to take the committee time right now, but if you could get back to me about what's going on with that, because I hope it's not going to hang up the proposed project, because we certainly need to do something with that land. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I would be happy to follow up with you, Representative. Thank you very much.
Other questions for Mr. Walter? Representative Delperdang.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, you had mentioned it in your talk, but obviously we're going to do the solar panels there, and it makes the magic happen. But the question is, if you're looking at 400 megawatts roughly of the solar panels, what kind of capacity on the battery so that the magic continues to happen at night?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the battery that we are developing here in our Kansas fleet is a single 30 megawatt battery. So that's 30 megawatts, and it's going to be a 4-hour duration battery. So that's 120 megawatt hours if you just simple math 30 times 4. The good thing about batteries, and the grid has made rules to accommodate for this, but batteries, you can think of them a lot like regular batteries. I like to think of them also like Legos. They're modular, right? So I can have, those old flashlights that have, 4D batteries in them. You can put 2 in them and it'll still work. You can put more of the batteries on and it'll work better, or it'll work longer, or it'll work more powerfully. We can continue to do that in the future, and when costs come down, I think we'll see that. But right now, we've got a single 30 megawatt battery. I'm hopeful that in the future, even once the project is completed on this, $1,800 acres, something like that. That's not just panels. That's everything within the fence line. That's the inverters, the substation, the tie line. So 7-ish acres is what we use for that. Right now, I believe that the sunflower manufacturing facility has far more acreage than we need. So I don't believe that we'll be papering over that entire facility, which is currently laying fallow and has been for decades with solar panels.
But you're talking still 3 to 4 sections of land.
A significant amount of land, to be sure.
Interesting. Okay. And any other reasons you're picking that particular site, the brownfield development?
Brownfield has been something that's been on the cutting edge of our industry for a long time. People tend to shy away from it because greenfield is cheaper, quite frankly. You don't have to worry about issues during construction of what if you dig into something that you didn't know was there? What if there's EPA regulations that you've got to deal with that add cost, that add time, that add risk to construction employees? So we have gotten excited about that plant for a number of reasons. I think it's effective, cost-effective land. There's strong interconnection, and the closer to load you can build any generation, the more efficient it is. So that facility being so close to Lawrence and the Kansas City area is really out
of the project.
That's right. I mean, we could very well buy them, but we would want to wait until closer to the date of the construction because who knows what kind of engineering. But in terms of supply chain, I like to watch what Tesla's doing, right? I like to figure out what Ford is doing. Where are they mining their lithium, and where are they going to figure out how to get it from A to B? Because they're the ones with the most.
A little bit of technical difficulties for our folks on WebEx. We want to make sure that they are back on audio and video before we proceed. Okay, I'm told we're back on. All right. Okay, next up, we have Joshua Swati, Senior Advisor with Agriculture and Intergovernmental Relations for Kansas Power Alliance. Mr. Swati, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be before all of you today. And it is kind of interesting to follow Mark in part because he's talking about solar and storage, things that are definitely happening right now. I'm kind of the ghost of Christmas future in this presentation, some things that are definitely on the horizon. But what's neat about it is that when I was a state representative about a year and a half into my tenure, there were At the time, it was one person, but he was working with two other people that started having public meetings in my district about a proposed wind farm that most of you, if you have ever driven to Colorado, would know. It's now the Smoky Hill Wind Farm there on the northern side of Ellsworth County along I-70. But that was Matt Gilhausen, who was one of the trio that started Tradewind, would have been 17 or 18 years ago. And so these presentations, you may think, what are we talking about here? But these are the things that are either happening or about to happen in your districts. And new records for wind penetration and renewable penetration at 82.7% and 85.3%, because that's going to direct a lot of my comments. Utilities have to build their fleet of generation around that maximum need. What is their peak demand for power, which typically happens in August, on the hottest day in August when everybody has their air conditions running. You can't have utility service if you are not prepared to handle the hottest day of summer, or as we all learned last year, the coldest day in February. So utilities and then the regional transmission organizations are all built to manage for those days, and they can do a number of things. They can hold on to their older generating units in small communities. They can build more transmission interconnects with other RTOs so that they can freely move power back and forth if they find themselves in a major peak moment. Or if you're Texas, you cannot do a lot of those things and have the whole system almost shut down in the middle of winter. But most RTOs have a broad range of those techniques at their hand to make sure that you can manage for those hottest days or coldest days on a system. The problem is, and it's not really a problem, it provides an opportunity, but what happens then is that you end up with a situation where you have a lot of generation that's needed for those hottest or coldest moments at peak demand that is maybe not as needed and if you look at this, you could see where this would be sort of a typical time where it might be not as needed. 3:58 a.m. was when that penetration was set on April 25th, 2021. And I don't know what the night was, but I'm going to go ahead and guess that April 24th was probably around 80 degrees. And then it got down to the mid 40s in the middle of the night there. So nobody really was using much heat in their house. No one was using much air conditioning in their house. And it was 3:58 a.m. in the morning. And so there just wasn't a lot of demand for power. And so as utilities build for that peak demand, they have to make sure that they have enough power possible to handle that demand situation. But at the same time, it's an open and free marketplace, so they want the cheapest power, and the cheapest power, as Mark also pointed out, has been wind, and now solar is coming online. So there's these new generating sources that are intermittent, but they are being put onto the system. So we end up with a situation where we have power oftentimes, frequently at night, that is incredibly cheap because there's just not a whole lot of demand for it. Or in some cases, it creates curtailments or traffic jams on the transmission system. So what do we do to manage for those nighttime loads of those generating sources that may be intermittent? There's a lot of different things we can do. You can see on my list there, electric vehicle charging is a great thing for the overall system, because guess what? Most of the time you're charging those electric vehicles in the middle of the night. And so all utilities would love to sell more electricity in the middle of the night. Storage, as Mark pointed out, can help balance those influxes of power over a couple of hours to help the whole system work a little better. Data centers, which we do not have a big one in Kansas yet, but data centers are enormously power hungry. They use a huge amount of electricity. Even the data centers now are figuring out, if we don't upload everybody's 18 million YouTube videos at 4 in the afternoon, and if we wait and do it at 3:58 in the morning, we can actually use the data center as something of a battery or a storage unit to take advantage of power in the middle of the night rather than using it in the middle of the day. But what I'm going to talk to you about today, because these are the things that I think you're going to start hearing a lot about here in the state of Kansas, is you can produce hydrogen and you can produce nitrogen fertilizer. So first of all, what on earth do I mean by producing hydrogen? You'll see two graphs there. The first one is the basic simple process of electrolysis. If you stick something down in water, and it usually needs salt or something in there to have the reaction, and give it a lot of electricity, you can separate the H2O molecule and produce hydrogen off of that. There's a lot of different ways that you can produce hydrogen. There's another graph below there about how you can do it in a gasifier. But the process, particularly electrolysis, is pretty simple. What on earth do you do with hydrogen? Well, as it turns out, we do a ton of things with hydrogen. And we do a ton of things in the state of Kansas with hydrogen. It's used in refineries. It's used in the making of steel. It is a critical component in the production of fertilizer. When we go to make ammonia, ammonia is NH3, the H is hydrogen, and you have to separate the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere, that's plentiful in the atmosphere, but it's in the form of dinitrogen. You didn't think you were going to get a chemistry lesson here at 9:45 on a Tuesday morning, but there's tons of nitrogen, there's tons of nitrogen in the atmosphere, but it's in the N2 form. It's unusable for us, and it's unusable for plants. We need it, plants need it, every growing thing needs nitrogen, but we have to take it from N2 down to a form that it's able to be uptaken by plants and then taken in by us eventually when we eat something, either a plant or something that ate a plant. To do that, you have to separate those, which is a very energy-intense process. And then once you separate those in that energy-intense process, you can add some hydrogen into it and make ammonia. So we use an enormous amount of hydrogen in the state of Kansas. And as companies have looked at, well, where are their cheap sources of power? Guess what? They're figuring it out. Middle of the night, we can take advantage of renewable, particularly renewable resources, but it doesn't have to be just renewable resources. If you think about it, of course, hydrogen or hydroelectric power is also renewable, but like nuclear facilities, they are a classic run them at 100% all the time, even straight through the middle of the night. So it's a question of where are there cheap sources of power in the middle of the night, and can we use them to produce something like hydrogen? The other reason that this works well is that these have to be industries that are able to accept intermittency. You can't run a hospital and just say, we want the electricity whenever it's cheapest. You need to be able to turn the MRI and the CAT scans on whenever you want them. But you can produce hydrogen only when it makes economic sense, when the electricity is absolutely at its cheapest. And that's why they work well to tie into these. And then the hydrogen would be shipped off to whatever industry might particularly need it. You can see then on the next few slides, this is happening in other states. Apex, one of our members at the Advanced Power Alliance, just announced a joint venture project with a hydrogen company. Enel, another member of ours, has been doing hydrogen projects in the state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma is actually kind of seen as a leader in hydrogen development off of renewable projects. And as a person that cares deeply for my home state of Kansas, I would tell you, Oklahoma is being talked about nationally as a leader in hydrogen, and they have done hardly anything to do that except that they formed a hydrogen task force. And then it got the industry talking about what might happen there, and they're seeing real investment because of that. So these are things that the committee and members of the legislature could potentially think about. There's also projects for hydrogen going into Louisiana. The next one I want to talk about is actual nitrogen itself. And there's a cool graph there showing the nitrogen cycle. There are tons of different places where we receive nitrogen in the overall nitrogen cycle. You can see, I don't know why they use what looks like a bighorn goat there, but one of the principal methods of returning nitrogen to the cycle is through animal waste. That's one of the ways it's been done historically through the years. There's also a lot of anaerobic microbes in the soil that produce nitrogen and are able to fix it from the N2 form in the atmosphere into a form that's usable for the plants, and they are able to take it up. But then there's also a really cool, if you look in the corner of that graph, you see some lightning there. Because it's a question, there's an element of where atmospheric nitrogen comes from. And some of you, if you farm, you will know this. After a good rain, of course, everything greens up a lot. Everything looks a lot better. Your lawns and your communities are going to look a lot greener. Some of that is the rain, but some of it is that when a bolt of electric lightning goes through the atmosphere, that energy is high enough that it can separate that N2 that's plentiful in the atmosphere and turn it into a form, it's basically nitric acid. That nitric acid dissolves into rain droplets, forming nitrates. And so it rains a very small amount of fertilizer down onto the ground. So even in instances of no animals or no aerobic microbes in the soil, there are methods by which naturally nitrogen can get fixed in the atmosphere and rain down. Again, back to this business and opportunity abhors a vacuum, people started thinking, well, if there's a lot of cheap electricity, could we invent a reactor that basically works like lightning? And you just take that electricity, focus it into a reactor, you draw an atmosphere, it blows those nitrogen molecules apart into a form that can be nitric acid, you run it through some water, and voila, you've got your fertilizer plant, and then you don't even have to deal with the high pressure of turning it into ammonia. So you'll see there a slide featuring Nitricity, which is a startup that came out of Stanford. And they have a project in the Central Valley of California where they are taking solar panels and using the electricity off of that solar panels to focus into what they're calling a lightning reactor, producing nitric acid and then putting it into the irrigation system on that. In that particular case, it's a pepper farm, right into the plants in the soil. The thing about both hydrogen and nitrogen is that they work well with intermittent sources, but they don't have to. And as that technology becomes more efficient, it could simply be a matter of plugging into any utilities grid if the price was right. If they could find the electricity cheap enough, they could put these anywhere they wanted to. But I would guess in at least the near term, the 5 to 10 year term, you're going to see hydrogen facilities and nitrogen facilities being attached to renewable installations, taking advantage of that intermittent power. But that's only because they want the cheapest power available. Otherwise, they can go wherever they want to be. If you see the end of that final slide on the new technology and the proven ideas, I tried really hard to have a slide of the Hindenburg. The director of the Kansas Power Alliance said that I was not allowed to do that. You'll see, to be faithful and make sure that I'm not providing misinformation, that's a U.S. Navy Zeppelin. It was actually filled with helium. Not hydrogen. The Hindenburg was filled with hydrogen. They used hydrogen because Americans had all the helium, so they used the only gas they could get their hands on. But then the picture next to it is a 130-year-old, or it's about a 115-year-old hydroelectric facility in Norway. This is Norsk Hydro, and they developed what they called the Norwegian Arc, which is basically the same premise behind splitting that nitrogen with electricity and producing nitrogen fertilizer. I use those two because both the hydrogen concept, electrolysis, and nitrogen direct from electricity are not new concepts. Hydrogen fell out of favor as a transportation fuel source, in large part because of the drama of the Hindenburg. And I don't want to be dismissive of any deaths, but it was only 35 deaths, but it was caught on camera and everybody watched it. And it's amazing, there can be moments in history that redirect everyone, and the entire industry was directed away from hydrogen after the Hindenburg in 1937. similar on the Norsk Hydro. That was the earliest major plant using the Norwegian Arc to produce nitrogen fertilizer. But shortly after that, BASF, which was a German company, in conjunction with Fritz Haber, produced the Haber-Bosch process, which was the high-pressure, high-temperature method of producing nitrogen and nitrogen fertilizer. And this was right before World War I. And if you know anything about ammonium nitrates, they don't also just make great fertilizer, they make really great bombs. And so when BASF produced an incredibly efficient and cheap method of producing that fertilizer and a lot of bombs, the rest of Europe and then the rest of the world basically adopted the Haber-Bosch process as the principal method of making fertilizer worldwide. And that's been the case since 1909 when the Haber-Bosch process was invented. So we may be returning to these previous ideas that because of some technological limitations 120 years ago weren't as adopted. But with cheaper electricity and better technology will probably be mainstream here in the very not too distant future, or in the case of hydrogen is really happening right now in some other states.
All right. We would stand for questions?
Sure.
All right. Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll tell you, Mr. Swati, this has been a very interesting presentation this morning, as was the prior one. I could sit here and talk to you about this all day. I could tell you about electrolysis and making hydrogen so that in the name of lab experiments, I could make things blow up, and then I learned how to make chlorine gas, but we don't want to get into those discussions. It'll get me arrested. I was looking, though, at my own personal power usage. I have a monitoring system. And what I'm finding is that during off-peak hours, I'm not drawing very much current from Evergy. Not surprising. During peak hours, that's seemingly when I'm drawing the juice. That could change if I just set my electric vehicle to charge during off-peak hours, and if I could use the electric clothes dryer at night after peak hours, and maybe if I baked cakes early in the morning. But there's no financial incentive for me to go to that inconvenience. How do we incentivize consumers like me to flip the switch on our EV so that it doesn't start to charge until 10 or 11 or 12 o'clock at night, when it might be easier to just have it charge as soon as I plug it in so it's hot and ready to go? If I get home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it's ready to go at 6 or 7. How do we incentivize me to be more responsible in my consumption of power?
Thank you, Representative Carmichael. Since I'm not here speaking on behalf of utilities, I get to treat that largely as a rhetorical question and not directly answer it, because, yeah, utilities would be the ones determining how to build those incentives or structure. But I would say, to your point, I think that we, all of us as consumers on the grid, will see a shift in the next 10 years. It's probably underway right now, just in terms of how we better manage the system. And it's going to be all of the above. It's going to be storage. It's going to be having the right mix of intermittent sources of power with other sources, combined cycled gas plants that you can flip on with a switch and turn it right back off when you're done with it. That works really well on those systems. And then it's going to be smarter meters so that consumers can take advantage of cheaper prices or also be participants in the balancing of that system grid. And then finally, it's going to be new opportunities taking advantage of intermittent power sources. So they need large sources of power, but they don't have to run 24 hours a day. They can flip on and off literally as fast as it would take for the grid operators to determine that they're going to have some particularly cheap power.
Mr. Chairman, if I might have a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I think it's more than rhetorical, Mr. Swati, because if we could incentivize folks like me to move 25% of our consumption to the middle of the night, frankly, we wouldn't need as much storage. We wouldn't need the batteries, because we'd be moving consumer demand into the non-peak hours. And that does take smart meters, and that takes a regulatory structure that incentivizes me to go to that tiny bit of inconvenience for heaven forbid, the common good. So I don't know if that, wouldn't you agree?
I don't have to agree with them.
Well, yeah. I do, yeah, and I shouldn't have said necessarily it was rhetorical. I think that's definitely a question for utilities and not necessarily on the generating or the consumption side of it. But yes, that's a very good point.
Representative Delperdang.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I love the presentation. It's just geeky enough that I can follow along. But what I wanted to touch on, just some of the things you've hit on when you get on, I was on page 5 with the electrolysis kind of example. That's real similar, almost in a reverse order of how the fuel cells work. But I'd love to hear your thoughts as we move forward. I've always preached for years, lithium is not the answer, but I really think hydrogen fuel cells are the answer. And do you see this taking off to the point where maybe we'd incentivize the previous rep there from not plugging into the grid and none of us having to plug into the grid to power our electric vehicles? Is this the answer?
So there are, this is sort of new frontier. I will say, I think it was Volkswagen went hard onto an electrolysis hydrogen fuel cell model for vehicles, and they have since pivoted in large part because it appeared to them, I think the entire industry was going the other direction. And a lot of it, and you guys have had this committee and others in this building have had this discussion about the overall infrastructure needs for a transportation system. We are the beneficiaries of 120 years of an infrastructure build out for fueling your cars so that I can generally know, even if I'm on fumes, I'm probably going to find somewhere where I can fuel it up and just keep going along as whatever I need. That does not happen overnight. And so the infrastructure necessary to keep the millions of cars on the road running easily and without any hiccups is not inconsequential. And I think that, again, back to that final slide of forks in the road 100 years ago when they chose different paths. I'm not saying that doesn't mean that we won't see hydrogen fuel cells as a major source of transportation fuel or transportation energy in the future. And I do think there are, particularly with over-the-road vehicles, transportation vehicles, you may see fleets shift to hydrogen as a fuel source. But again, it's a matter of we are in the just kind of coming out of the gestation age of this as we figure all of these out, and you're going to start to see these ideas a little more.
Thank you. Any other questions for this conferee? All right. Thank you very much, Josh. Next up, we have the director of the public policy for the Kansas Power Alliance, the one who had the good sense not to put a burning gas bag plunging towards the earth in her presentation. Kimberly Swati. Kimberly, welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And my name is Kimberly Swati. And so I'm just going to kind of try and, as Mark alluded to, tying a bow around a development project, kind of tie a bow around everything that you've heard this morning. So in fact, Representative Delperdang, to your question, just yesterday, I read a really interesting article in Utility Dive, and it was talking about whether or not we're moving more towards hydrogen fuel cells or just lithium batteries for EV. And so just there is that great debate. And what's interesting about the debate is this discussion that it's not a zero-sum game. We don't necessarily have to choose one or the other. Where the United States and supply chain issues may drive one way, what we may see in other countries, based upon their needs and their systems and structures, may go another way. And in the end, all of the R&D that comes out of both choices will actually eventually cross over and end up providing us with better ideas and better technologies. So it's actually kind of fun. On behalf of the Advanced Power Alliance, we do have more than 40 members, and they are the BPs, Shells, Chevrons, they are the Savions and Enels and Nexteras. So we have some of the world's 20 largest utilities. 14 of them are already doing business in Kansas. When we look at the companies that for the longest time were considered the super majors, they were the BPs, the Shells, Exxon Mobils, and yes, they still are super majors, but we have the new super majors, which are the Nexteras and Avangrids and Enels that are, and Orstads, all of which are doing business in the state of Kansas. So the historical super majors and the new super majors from a market cap standpoint are all doing business in the state of Kansas. And that's fantastic for us because it brings in all the new jobs and new investment. And I so appreciate Mark Walter's comments related to how projects are developed, whether it's on the wind side or solar or storage. Savion, I think, is a fantastic representative of how it is our industry has truly tried to develop projects in the state of Kansas and nationally, but I'm really focused on how we develop projects here in the state of Kansas. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that every single developer operates exactly the way Savion does. But I will say that from the Advanced Power Alliance standpoint, if you're a member of our organization, we have expectations for how you come into a community, for how you come into a state, how you work with landowners, how you work with community leaders. And so there was a project in the state of Kansas that they were not a member of the organization. We did not believe in how they developed their project. That project completely and totally stalled out for many, many years. It was purchased by a new company, Orstad. They have since entirely retooled the project, retooled how they've handled the community, how they've handled their leases. And I feel like now that we actually do have a good project that is in the development stage. So it's not operational yet. But we, as the Advanced Power Alliance, we are the Advanced Power Alliance. We are not the Wind Coalition anymore. All of our member companies are in the business of renewables development, but it's really advanced power solutions. So yes, it may be wind, there may be solar, there may be storage, but so many of our organizations are now in the hydrogen space. They're working on the nitrogen space. They're working on technologies around the world that we can then bring here to the state of Kansas and create jobs and investment. And probably in the long run, alter our economy. And it actually drives me crazy that, as you saw in Josh's handout, or in Josh's presentation, there was the quotes from the Secretary of Commerce in Oklahoma and from the Secretary of Commerce and from their Secretary of Energy and Environment lauding this potentially 550 million or megawatt hydrogen facility. And this announcement just occurred. Drives me crazy that it's happening in Oklahoma. I was trying so hard to have it happen in Kansas. And literally all they did, as Josh mentioned, was they put together a hydrogen task force about this time last year. And they met over the summer, they put out some recommendations, and boom, the industry just went there. And so there's no reason that Kansas couldn't essentially usurp that leadership role on the part of Oklahoma. There were a couple of comments recently made going back to a presentation that was provided by the nuclear folks, and they mentioned that a lot of the turbines now in Kansas are about 2 megawatts or maybe a little bit less than 2 megawatts. And so I wanted to kind of follow back up with that. We do have our older operating projects in the state of Kansas are, 1.8 megawatt turbines, but most of them now are well in the 2.8 capacity. We do have some 3 megawatt turbines, and we actually have some that are proposed for development soon that are going to be 6 megawatt individual turbines. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the towers are getting taller. They are getting taller, but not that much taller. What's really happening is the blades are getting longer. And so they're able to sweep more and capture more electricity that way, which also lessens the project footprint. So there was discussion about for a 440 megawatt solar facility, it would take about 2,800 acres of ground. For a 200 megawatt wind facility, you are leasing, you're not using, because you're only using about 1%, but you're leasing perhaps 20,000 acres of ground. You're really only using 1%. Nevertheless, the project footprint would be substantially smaller if you were using 6 megawatts or even a 3 megawatt turbine. So I have some statistics in here about, wind development in Kansas. Certainly you can read that at your leisure, but I did just, appreciate the opportunity to get to bring to you all the folks from Savion. We were hoping to have some additional representatives from some of our member companies specifically talk to you about solar or about storage and hydrogen, the projects that they are literally working on right now. Just timing wise, it didn't work. But we appreciate your willingness to hear about what we're doing and why we're doing it in Kansas and how we hope to continue to work with you all going forward. So I won't spend any more time talking about what we've done already, but I'm definitely happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Representative Carmichael?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Swati, I just keep hearing lots of good things today. I'm glad we're having this hearing because there has been developments in the past few years that honestly I wasn't aware of. One of them is what you alluded to with a hydrogen plant in Oklahoma. Is that correct?
Yes. And it was just announced, Representative Carmichael. It's moving forward, and we have the specifics in your packet. It is about a 325 megawatt facility that could go up to 550 megawatts. And it's a partnership, and they've actually they've coined it H2OK, H2 Hydrogen Oklahoma. But
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And then Louisiana is also doing another really exciting project as well related to green hydrogen.
I'm interested in how our neighbors to the south managed to attract this new technology and presumably capital investment and jobs into Oklahoma. I think you said that it's only been within the past year that the entire thing came to fruition. But what I'd like to know is, in order to attract this new industry and these jobs and these taxes into Oklahoma, was it necessary that they have legislators sign non-disclosure agreements, that they invest millions, if not billions of dollars in tax incentives, and that they do it all behind closed doors? Or was it an open public process that allowed them to attract this cutting edge industry into their state instead of ours?
So, Mr. Chairman, or Representative Carmichael, appreciate the question. I cannot speak to the specifics on what was or wasn't signed in Oklahoma. But what I can tell you is they did develop a task force. The industry paid attention to the task force, and they then worked with the Department of Commerce down there, the Department of Energy and Environment, and they cited a project in Oklahoma. Certainly on our weekly calls, I fought long and hard for that investment to come to Kansas. Again, it would have been a private investment, no tax incentives or whatnot. I can't speak to the tax structure in Oklahoma, but I do know that we certainly tried to push real hard for that investment in Kansas. I will say, we spend a lot of time in Kansas. We have spent a lot of time this session and last session trying to push the industry away and trying to send a message to the industry that Kansas is not the stable investment climate that it had been for the last 20 years. And when you have a resource that essentially is as quality from North Dakota all the way down into Texas, we're competing every single day. There are very little differences in the quality of the output of projects. And so from an industry standpoint and from an investment standpoint, and so when I talk about the hedge funds and I talk about venture capital to you all, they're all watching and paying attention for where investment can and should go. And they will go where it's welcome. And so where we've spent a lot of time trying to discourage the investment in the state, not so much on the House side, but people are watching. And so I would love to bring that back to Kansas.
Thank you, Ms. Swati. I agree, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Gartner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kimberly, good to see you. Hydrogen really piques my interest, and what really I don't like hearing about is losing to Oklahoma, anything to Oklahoma. I spent some time down in Oklahoma as a lobbyist, and I wanted to get out of there as soon as I could, and I did, thank goodness. But the question is, what, from your perspective, what do we need to do from a public policy standpoint to put together something or a policy that makes us attractive to those investors? That's what I'd like to hear. Thank you.
So from an industry, we've never come to the State House and asked for an incentive. We've never said we necessarily need X, Y, or Z. The industry has come to Kansas and flourished because we had the policies that had been put in place largely under Chairman Holmes created a very stable environment. Then we did make modifications to that in 2011 when we did the Flint Hills box, and we said no renewable energy development on the native tallgrass prairie. That was largely driven by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife map. We certainly did that in 2015 when we adjusted the property tax exemption, rightfully adjusted the property tax exemption from a life of the project exemption to a 10-year exemption to create parity among all forms of generation. So we're not necessarily going to ask for anything because we have, as in the state of Oklahoma, we have the natural resources, we have the human capital, we have the workforce, we have the Regents institutions. So the mix is already there. It's really just don't put up a bunch of roadblocks and don't send a lot of signals that would discourage investment. I'm sure there are some, policy things here and there, but not that are going to move the needle in the way that we've seen the needle moved in the last 7 years with literally billions of dollars of investment that have come to the state of Kansas. You don't necessarily have to have as we've seen in Oklahoma, it was literally a task force convened by, I think, the Oklahoma Chamber and a couple of other groups that had a handful of meetings, and there were legislators involved, but it was not something that they had to pass via legislation. So we could look at what are the advanced energy solutions, and how would we try and attract them to the state. So when we're talking about just this morning, Ford came out and said that at the Clay Como plant, 115 new jobs to make the EV trucks, that they literally cannot keep up with demand. Also this morning, a 625% increase in EV vehicles, specifically trucks for transportation and delivery, and that they're seeing projecting 10 times that growth almost every single year for the next 10 years. How do we make sure that that happens in Kansas for GM, for Ford, for Tesla? Why is it that Tesla is looking at Oklahoma and Austin for their manufacturing facilities, and why is Kansas not in the mix? So maybe it's not even legislation. Maybe it's just a group of kind of the thought leaders from a business standpoint, talking with industry and talking with venture capital and saying, let's put it all together.
Representative Delperdang with the last question for this conferee.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. You're hitting on some really interesting questions that I was going to ask as far as the environment and how do we get it here. I appreciate the previous question, but if I can refer to it as Swati speaker number one, hit on the
senior advisor.
Yeah, he had a few call outs there on ammonia plants, for example, which is NH3. Falls right into the hydrogen realm there. But I know there's ammonia manufacturing plants in Oklahoma. What do we have here in Kansas already here that we may be able to leverage moving forward to do the productions?
If I may, Mr. Chairman. Yes, so Kansas, probably no surprise to some of you, particularly from Wichita, Koch Industries, one of their bedrock blue chips within their fleet is Koch fertilizer. They have 3 plants in Kansas producing various different things. They have an ammonia-only plant in Conway Springs, which is just outside of McPherson. They have an ammonia and I think urea plant in Dodge City. If anyone's ever driven just east of Dodge, it's the great big plant right to the south of the highway outside of Dodge City. And then I think it's Grinnell or Grainfield has a urea plant up by I-70. And so, and there may be, those are the Koch installations that I know of. There may be other fertilizer producers. There are not many fertilizer producers in the world. Yara, which is Norwegian, is a big one. Koch is also a big one, and these are largely private companies, so I don't want to venture to tell you who's biggest. It may be Koch, but Kansas is well positioned in the fertilizer industry. Yes, for sure.
And that's what I was getting to. I think we've already got the basics here. We just need to expound on it. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Bo. Our last conferee today is Malcolm Proudfit, CEO of Good Energy Solutions, Inc., and I think he's appearing via WebEx this morning. He's with us virtually. Is Mr. Goodfit on?
Yes. Can everybody hear me okay?
I think we can hear you. Is your video? There we go. We've got you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Proudfit.
Perfect. Chairman Finch, members of the committee, thank you so much for having me this morning. I had hoped to deliver my remarks in person today, but after nearly 2 years of avoiding COVID-19, it finally caught up to me. Hopefully sometime in the future, I'll be able to deliver remarks in person in committee. I would look forward to that. Today, I wanted to speak on behalf of solar generally in the state of Kansas, although I will focus my remarks on residential distributed generation. I'm here to represent myself, but also everybody that's employed in solar in the state of Kansas, and particularly my talented colleagues at Good Energy Solutions. For those of you that don't know, Good Energy Solutions is a solar installer and electrical contractor that was founded in Lawrence by Kevin and Shauna Good in 2007. And they operated out of their garage until 2015, when they moved into a 5,000 square foot office building here in Lawrence. The company grew slowly at first, but eventually some employees were hired, larger contracts were won, the business grew in credibility, and they built their brand. And the company even acquired another electrical contractor, a competitor in the market. Almost 15 years later, today, Good Energy Solutions employs 40 people full-time, and we're actively seeking to fill 4 or 5 positions right at this very moment. We currently show no signs of slowing down, and I know that the same holds true for all of our competitors in the state. From 2020 to 2021, through the pandemic, we saw a substantial increase in demand for residential solar systems, and we were pushed to our capacity to keep up with that demand. Now, you might be asking, why is solar in such high demand right now in the middle of a pandemic amidst so much economic uncertainty? One of the larger factors here to explain this is the drastic reduction in pricing for solar systems. The market saw a 12.3% reduction in residential system prices from 2020 to 2021. And so this implies that the opportunity cost of not going solar is increasing each year for the average homeowner. Customers are also interested more recently in energy solutions coupled with batteries that will back up critical loads in the case of a power outage. Currently, the systems we sell, about 20 to 25% of them are sold with a battery attached. This is a stark increase from years past. We used to only see about a 5 to 10% attachment rate for backup storage systems. And this increase in battery attachment rates is certainly a good thing, because a solar system with a battery interacts much less with the grid than a system with no battery. Like I mentioned earlier, Good Energy Solutions has 40 full-time employees. It may surprise you when I say that 20 of those jobs have been created in the past 18 months. And that if Good Energy Solutions continues to grow at this pace, I could add another 20 jobs to the community in another 18 months. Renewables, and particularly solar, are presenting an amazing economic growth opportunity, with the overall industry projected to grow at a compounded annual growth rate of 20% year over year for the next 5 to 10 years, which is just a breakneck speed. Part of this growth for Good Energy Solutions recently has been the opportunity to work alongside Evergy on some larger scale projects like the Baldwin City Solar Farm or the West Plains Solar Farm, the latter of which is a 10.8 megawatt solar farm consisting of nearly 26,000 solar panels that just wrapped up weeks ago. Working with Evergy has shown me that we are working towards the same goal, to provide low-cost energy to customers in the cleanest way possible. The relationship between the renewables industry and the utility companies has always been a strained one, and I do not believe it has to be adversarial. And I believe that middle ground can be reached on most issues that we discuss here. One area of particular concern for me and for my company is the 1% cap on distributed generation. While it isn't an immediate problem, and we're not butting up against that 1% cap right now, it could become a problem in 2 to 3 years at this pace. This is something that we need to deal with pretty soon here, because a hard limit on solar installations in the state, if we reach it, it would put dozens of companies out of business in the blink of an eye, and hundreds of people would lose their jobs. Municipalities would lose tax revenue and capital investment, and I believe Kansas as a whole would be worse off for it. I'll leave my comments there today. I want to cut myself short here, but happy to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Proudfit. We certainly wish you a speedy recovery. Are there any questions from members of the committee? All right, seeing none, thank you, sir. Committee, by way of an update, I think we're going to take on some presentations about broadband on Thursday, which will be timely considering the technical difficulties our network seems to be having today. Maybe we can get some of those spark dollars spent right here in 582. And then we'll be turning our attention in the coming weeks to some more information. Time, if you decide you want to put in a solar installation, what does it mean if you want to put in a coal plant? What does it mean if you want to put in a nuclear reactor? So I want you to kind of understand that from beginning to end. I think that helps us all as we talk about the long tail of decisions that get made in this committee in 2022, and that could be affecting things well into the next decade. So thanks to all of our presenters today. Thank you to committee for your rapt attention, and we'll see you Thursday to talk about broadband. We are adjourned.